Welcome everyone to another post-playthrough thoughts and review video. I had a few months where I was far too busy to produce these videos, unfortunately, and because of that, the Vampire review sat at about 80% completion for quite a while, actually. And as a result, I've got quite a bit of a backlog to deal with. However, my school year's finally over, and so it's finally time to take on that backlog. Today, as usual, I'll be taking you guys through my thoughts and history with a game we played through on stream. In this video, I'll be talking about Super Metroid, a classic that I was experiencing for the very first time. Here are my thoughts. As is the case with many Nintendo franchises, I was first exposed to the Metroid franchise through Smash Bros., though that exposure was quite limited. I thought Samus looked really cool in Melee, and the first time I saw her in action was actually during the Subspace Emissary in Brawl. Unfortunately, there were a few factors that led to my first experience with Metroid coming over a decade after I first saw Samus. Firstly, my childhood consoles were the PlayStation 2, followed by the Wii. Having a PS2 meant that I missed out on a lot of Nintendo experiences that I would have loved, and the Wii era saw a reduction in the number of Metroid releases. This meant I was lacking quite a bit of background that would spark an interest in the franchise. Secondly, Metroid has more niche and mature appeal than the flagship Nintendo franchises. The result being that I ultimately tried out Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon among others first, pushing Metroid to the side a bit. At that age, I didn't have much of an interest in learning about Nintendo history either, so it took a long time for me to discover what Metroid really was outside of its protagonist's appearance in Smash. Of course, being around the internet, I eventually caught wind of the immense popularity of Super Metroid and of Metroid Prime. Hearing more about the games made me really want to try them, and eventually during high school I found an incredible deal. Metroid Prime Trilogy, a game I knew was well beyond affordable for a student like myself, appeared on the Wii U eShop for about $12. This was my chance. I could not pass up this offer, and suddenly I owned Metroid Prime 1, 2, and 3. I played all 3 games in a row, and thoroughly enjoyed them. The eShop enabled me to expand my Metroid collection at a rapid pace, but I burned myself out on Metroid a bit after my Prime marathon, especially since I consider 3 to be the weakest in the trilogy. My only experience with 2D Metroid was about 30 to 60 minutes of Metroid 2, but given that it had been a few years since my last Metroid experience, I felt a desire to try Super Metroid, which had been installed on my Wii U but never touched for years. Super Metroid is considered by many to be the pinnacle of this series, but with it being my first 2D experience, did I see eye to eye with the masses? I just want to preface my review by reminding everyone that I literally hadn't been born yet during the Super Nintendo era, so I don't have a perfect understanding of what was standard back then in terms of audio and visuals. I do have to say that I'm quite impressed with the presentation of the game overall. The soundtrack is lonely and atmospheric, and augments the feeling of exploring your way through Planet Zebes tremendously. There's a few tracks with a harsh sound font that I didn't enjoy as much, but overall I loved the soundtrack, especially since I recognized a few tracks that went on to be remastered and repurposed in the Metroid Prime trilogy, adding that sense of nostalgia. The themes that played throughout Meridia in particular, I would say would be my favorites. Graphically, I'm also pleased with Super Metroid. Each of the main 4 areas have plenty of distinct sub-areas, which are all fairly pretty. The sprite work is well done, with Samus being greatly animated, and enemies and bosses all looking detailed and distinct. I never felt like I couldn't understand what I was looking at, which can be a concern when sprites are badly implemented. The game also runs at a clean 60 frames per second, which is a very nice touch. The absolute coolest aspect of the presentation, in my opinion, was that there were moments in the game when I felt genuinely creeped out. A Super Nintendo game had enough of a tense atmosphere with the limited resources available on that console to make me feel uneasy and frightened, which I believe is a testament to how good Super Metroid's audio and visual design is. Super Metroid's story exists mostly as a framework to justify your presence on Zebes, which I don't think is a huge problem. The game opens with a cutscene explaining the events of Super Metroid's predecessors on the NES and the Game Boy, before presenting you with your objective through gameplay. Ridley has stolen the baby Metroid that grew attached to Samus at the end of Metroid 2, and she has to get it back. From that point onwards, there's no real plot development until near the end, and everything happens through gameplay. No dialogue, no tutorial, no cutscenes, nothing. Super Metroid's narrative is not the focus. The entire game relies on its gameplay, and with that in mind, I feel the narrative presentation around this game is perfectly fine. Fortunately, Super Metroid's gameplay is damn good, and I see now that Metroid Prime borrowed quite a lot from it. Samus controls nicely, able to aim her Arden Cannon in 8 directions, allowing for quite a bit of freedom in taking your shots. Interacting with your sub-weapons can be a little bit clunky unless you need the first item in the list, missiles, but fortunately there's a button that resets you back to your beam, which removes a lot of the clunkiness from the system. However, although the controls are generally good, there's definitely some moments in which they're immensely finicky. The space jump tends to fail without a very precise rhythm, despite that rhythm sometimes being unclear. And I'd argue that the charge shot feels significantly clunkier than it does in a newer game like Metroid Prime, partially because of where the jump and shoot buttons are mapped. It felt great on a Wii Remote, but less so here, resulting in the charge feeling significantly less useful or impactful than missiles. Movement, however, feels much better once you amass some skill and upgrades. I'm quite fond of the way Super Metroid handles tutorials regarding advanced techniques, despite them being fairly cryptic. Throughout the game, you can run into various animals demonstrating how to perform these techniques in a situation that forces you to learn. Unfortunately, I never learned how to perform a wall jump since I didn't realize this in time during my playthrough, and I had the upgrades to bypass the tutorial, so my skills were lacking a bit. I think I would have had a lot more fun with my playthrough had I learned this technique. Luckily, I did have the time to play with the game's many upgrades, which all felt like a natural extension of what Samus can do, and serve as the driving force of the best part of Super Metroid's gameplay: exploration. Combat has never been the focal point of the Metroid franchise, instead serving as an augmentation of the core explorative experience. However, I should address it now before transitioning into the next segment. I found Super Metroid's combat to be okay. It's not stellar, but it's still genuinely fun. There were some frustrations surrounding enemy placements and some really fast enemies or bosses that seemed impossible to dodge without slowing the pace of the game to a crawl, especially when coupled with some of the clunkier controls, but that's very likely influenced by my unfamiliarity with 2D shooters. Plus, the difficulty made boss fights a lot more tense and enjoyable, so it's not like this is an entirely negative point. The exploration aspect of Super Metroid is by far the most engaging part of the experience. I already mentioned when discussing the graphics that each sub-area looks distinct to the point that no two rooms blend together. It's always very clear where you are in relation to other rooms, so the only way you can genuinely get lost is if you forget where you've been. And forgetting is part of the fun. Super Metroid only gives very loose directions by restricting access to certain areas. At the game's opening, you aren't told where to go and you just have to figure it out on your own. Throughout my playthrough, I usually had an idea of where to go next based on things I'd seen before and blank spots on my map, but this wasn't always the case, and searching for that next progression point was very engaging to me when I had no ideas, as it prompted me to reason my way through the map. As a result of the game's structure, which involves teasing you with blocked destinations that you can clearly see, backtracking is fundamental to the experience. This may appear to be a negative, but Metroid is known as a franchise that makes backtracking work exceptionally well. Nearly every room seems to have a secret which can be accessed by returning with a greater arsenal, and finding the most obscure of the loot is an immensely rewarding feeling. I'm having a bit of a hard time explaining why I love the exploration in this game, but I've loved the franchise's exploration structure since I played Prime. Super Metroid is just a genuinely engaging experience, with sights to see and secrets to discover, the whole time conveying that you discovered everything with minimal assistance. That just about sums up Super Metroid. I have to confess that this script was fairly difficult to write for some reason, as despite enjoying the game quite a lot, it was tricky to explain what I loved about it. The game is not perfect, and its age is apparent in the controls department, but otherwise it holds up fantastically today. But don't just take my word for it. Look to its community. Super Metroid has cemented itself as a pillar in speedrunning thanks to its structure lending itself fantastically to sequence breaks and rewarding game knowledge. and its credits explicitly displaying completion time and percentage. I included complaints in my review, but realistically, most of them are nitpicks. My experience with Super Metroid was nothing but positive, except for when I got stuck on the new bridge, I suppose. On my blind playthrough, 25 years after the game's release, I earned 74% completion, which I think is pretty good. Honestly, having finally completed the game, I have a newfound appreciation for what Metroid Prime borrowed, and I'm excited that I can finally watch speedruns of the game. I can't wait for Metroid Prime 4's release now. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching this video. If you haven't played this classic yet, I'd fully recommend it, and if you have, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Did you disagree with what I said? Would you like to complain about my inexperience and my bad gameplay? Either way, I'd love the discussion. If this is the first you've seen of my content, you can find me at twitch.tv/turkeysub23. And if you join me for these Metroid streams, thanks for keeping my experience spoiler-free and for sharing this adventure with me. Have a wonderful day, take care, and remember, save the animals.